For 23 long years, David had dreamed of this moment. He stood on the front porch of his new home, breathing in the fresh morning air and looking out across 15 acres of pure possibility. The rolling hills stretched as far as he could see, covered in wild grass that danced in the gentle breeze. A small creek meandered through the property, its water sparkling in the early sunlight. This wasn't just land to him. This was freedom. David had worked as a mechanical engineer at the same company since college. Every single paycheck, he had put aside whatever money he could. No fancy vacations, no expensive cars, no dining out at costly restaurants. His friends used to joke that he lived like a monk, but David had a bigger picture in mind. He wanted something that was truly his own, something nobody could take away from him. The farmhouse was old but solid. Built in the 1940s, it had good bones and character that you just don't find in modern homes. The previous owner was an elderly farmer who had lived there alone for decades. When David first walked through the property 6 months earlier, he fell in love instantly. The asking price was fair, and after some negotiation, the deal was done. Moving day had been chaotic but exciting. David's brother helped him load the moving truck, constantly shaking his head and asking why anyone would want to live so far from the city. But David knew exactly why. He was tired of apartment living, tired of noisy neighbors, tired of feeling like he never had space to breathe. This property was his chance to build something meaningful. The neighborhood around his land was interesting. Most of the surrounding area had been developed into a subdivision called Millbrook Hills about 10 years ago. These were nice homes with perfectly cut lawns and matching mailboxes. The homeowners had formed an association to keep everything looking neat and organized. David's property was different, though. It had been there long before the subdivision was built, which meant he wasn't part of their homeowners group. He was grandfathered in, so to speak. This turned out to be a blessing because it meant David could use his land however he wanted. The property was zoned for agriculture, which gave him plenty of options. He could have animals if he wanted, grow crops, build additional structures, basically anything that made sense for rural living. The first few weeks were like a honeymoon period. David spent his days after work and entire weekends exploring every corner of his new home. He discovered an old apple tree that still produced fruit, found the remains of what used to be a chicken coop, and even located a hand-dug well that was still functional. Each discovery felt like finding buried treasure. His new neighbors seemed friendly enough at first. The Johnsons lived closest to him, just across a small field. They waved when they saw him working outside and even brought over a casserole during his first week. Mrs. Johnson mentioned how nice it was to have someone taking care of the old place again, since it had been empty for almost 2 years before David bought it. The Millers lived on the other side and seemed pleasant too. Mr. Miller was retired and spent most of his time working in his garage. He came over one evening when he saw David struggling to fix a broken gate and offered to lend some tools. They ended up talking for over an hour about the history of the area and how much it had changed over the years. Even the folks at the local hardware store were welcoming. The owner, Tom, had run the business for 30 years and knew everything about everyone in the area. When David introduced himself, Tom immediately remembered the old farmer who used to live there and shared stories about the property. He offered advice about local contractors and where to buy supplies at the best prices. David's first major project was clearing some of the overgrown areas around the house. Years of neglect had allowed bushes and weeds to take over what used to be landscaped areas. He rented a brush cutter and spent several weekends cutting everything back to manageable levels. The work was hard but satisfying. He could see immediate progress with each passing day. During this cleanup process, several neighbors stopped by to chat. They seemed curious about his plans for the property and generally supportive of his efforts to fix it up. One neighbor even mentioned that having someone actively maintaining the place would probably help all their property values. David started sketching out bigger plans for his land. He wanted to create a large vegetable garden where he could grow his own food, The soil seemed rich and the location got good sunlight throughout the day. He also thought about maybe getting some chickens for fresh eggs and perhaps a couple of goats to help keep the grass trimmed naturally. The house itself needed work, but nothing too major. The roof was solid, the foundation was good, and all the basic systems worked properly. David planned to update the kitchen and bathrooms gradually, doing as much of the work himself as possible. He had always been handy with tools and enjoyed working with his hands. One of his favorite discoveries was a large oak tree near the back of the property. It must have been over 100 years old, with massive branches that created perfect natural shade. David could easily imagine putting a picnic table there someday, maybe even building a treehouse if he ever had kids. The peace and quiet of country living took some getting used to. After years of city noise, traffic, sirens, neighbors, silence at night was almost overwhelming at first. But gradually, David learned to appreciate the natural sounds. Crickets chirping, owls calling, the wind rustling through the trees. It was like living inside a nature documentary. His commute to work was longer now, but David didn't mind. The drive through countryside roads was actually relaxing compared to fighting city traffic. He used the time to think and plan, often stopping at roadside stands to buy fresh produce from local farmers. About 2 months after moving in, David hosted his first barbecue. He invited a few co-workers and some of his new neighbors. Everyone seemed to enjoy themselves, admiring the property, and complimenting David on the progress he had made. The Johnsons brought homemade potato salad, and Mr. Miller helped him grill burgers on the old barbecue pit he had restored. During the party, people asked about his long-term plans. David shared his ideas about the garden and maybe some small livestock. Most seemed interested and encouraging. Mrs. Johnson mentioned that her grandmother used to keep chickens and how fresh the eggs were compared to store-bought ones. As summer progressed, David settled into a comfortable routine. Weekday evenings were spent on smaller projects around the house. Painting, minor repairs, organizing tools. Weekends were for bigger undertakings like fence repairs and land management. He was building something real, something lasting. The property began to feel less like a house he had bought and more like a true home. Every improvement he made, every problem he solved, every small success added to his sense of ownership and belonging. This wasn't just about having a place to live. It was about creating a legacy, building something that would last for generations. Looking back on those first few months, David would later realize how naive he had been about small-town politics and neighborhood dynamics. He had assumed that being a good neighbor and maintaining his property well would be enough to fit in. The initial friendliness had fooled him into thinking he had found his perfect place in the world. But those early days were genuinely happy times. David felt like he was living the American dream, working hard, buying property, building something with his own hands. He went to sleep each night tired but satisfied, knowing he was exactly where he was supposed to be. The future looked bright and full of possibilities. The first sign that something was changing came on a Tuesday morning in late August. David was loading his truck for work when he noticed Mrs. Johnson watching him from her kitchen window. Instead of her usual friendly wave, she just stared for a moment before quickly closing the curtains. It was such a small thing that David almost dismissed it, but something about the interaction felt different from their previous encounters. Over the next few weeks, similar small changes began adding up. The casual conversations at the mailbox stopped happening. When David worked in his yard on weekends, he noticed fewer neighbors outside doing their own yard work. The friendly nods when he drove through the subdivision became rare, then disappeared completely. It was like an invisible wall was slowly being built between him and the community he thought he was becoming part of. David tried to convince himself he was imagining things. Maybe people were just busy with back-to-school activities or dealing with their own problems. But the shift was undeniable, and it coincided perfectly with his decision to start the agricultural projects he had been planning since moving in. The trouble really began when David bought his first chickens. He had researched everything carefully, checking all the local zoning laws and regulations. His property was clearly zoned for agricultural use, and keeping chickens was completely legal. He built a proper coop, installed good fencing, and bought 6 healthy hens from a reputable local farmer. The chickens were well behaved, stayed within their designated area, and provided David with fresh eggs every morning. 3 days after the chickens arrived, David found an official-looking letter in his mailbox. It was from the Millbrook Hills Homeowners Association, addressed to him with formal legal language that made his stomach drop. The letter complained that his livestock operation was creating noise disturbances and offensive odors that were negatively impacting the peaceful enjoyment of neighboring properties. David read the letter 3 times, growing more confused with each reading. The chickens made virtually no noise except for occasional quiet clucking. There were no roosters, so no early morning crowing. As for odors, he cleaned the coop regularly and composted the manure properly. He walked the perimeter of his property. That evening, trying to imagine how anyone could be bothered by his 6 quiet hens. The next week brought another letter, this time complaining about his vegetable garden. David had spent months planning and preparing a large garden plot near the back of his house. He grew tomatoes, peppers, corn, beans, and squash, all organized in neat rows with proper spacing and support structures. The garden was productive and well-maintained, providing him with fresh vegetables throughout the growing season. According to the HOA letter, his garden was an unsightly agricultural operation that was inconsistent with the residential character of the neighborhood. They demanded he remove it immediately or face potential legal action. David stared at the letter in disbelief. How could growing food in his own backyard be a problem for anyone? He decided to visit the HOA president, Patricia Whitfield, to discuss the situation face-to-face. Patricia lived in one of the larger homes in the subdivision and served as the HOA's leader for the past 5 years. When David knocked on her door, she answered, but didn't invite him inside. "I got your letters," David began politely. "I wanted to talk about the concerns you raised." Patricia's expression was cold and businesslike. "There's nothing to discuss. Your property might not be technically part of our HOA, but your activities are affecting our community's standards and property values." David tried to explain that his land was zoned for agriculture and that everything he was doing was completely legal. Patricia interrupted him mid-sentence. "Legal and appropriate are 2 different things," she said firmly. "This is a residential neighborhood, not a farm. Your chickens and that garden make the whole area look rural and unkempt. People moved here for suburban living, not to look at agricultural operations." The conversation lasted only a few minutes, but it left David feeling frustrated and confused. He had never considered that improving his property and using it productively could be seen as negative by his neighbors. Things escalated quickly after that meeting. David received a visit from the county code enforcement officer, who had apparently received multiple complaints about his property. The officer, a friendly man named Pete, walked around David's land with a clipboard and camera, documenting everything carefully. "I have to investigate every complaint we receive," Pete explained apologetically. "But I can tell you right now that you're not violating any county codes. Your property is properly zoned, your structures are legal, and everything looks well maintained." Pete's official report found no violations, but the complaints didn't stop. Over the next month, code enforcement visited David's property 3 more times, always finding the same result: no violations of any kind. Each time, Pete seemed more embarrassed about having to respond to what were obviously frivolous complaints. The harassment began taking other forms, too. David's pickup truck became a target of criticism in another HOA letter. According to the complaint, his commercial vehicle was inappropriate for a residential area. David laughed when he read this one. His truck was a standard pickup that he used for personal transportation and occasional hauling of supplies for his property projects. Half the driveways in the subdivision had similar vehicles. When David announced his plans to install solar panels on his roof, the HOA responded with their strongest letter yet. They claimed the solar installation would create an industrial appearance that will significantly damage property values throughout the community. They threatened to file formal complaints with multiple county departments if he proceeded with the project. David researched solar panel regulations extensively and found that he had every right to install them. In fact, the county encouraged renewable energy installations and offered tax incentives for homeowners who chose solar power, but the constant opposition was wearing him down. The situation got worse when David started having friends over regularly. He had always been social and enjoyed hosting small gatherings on weekends. His property was perfect for outdoor activities, plenty of space for parking, a fire pit area, and room for games and conversation. These weren't wild parties, just normal social gatherings with music at reasonable volumes. But even these innocent gatherings became sources of complaint. Neighbors began calling the police whenever David had visitors, reporting suspicious activity and disturbances. The police would arrive, find nothing wrong, and leave after brief conversations with David and his guests. The officers were always professional and understanding, but the constant interruptions were embarrassing and stressful. One particularly ridiculous incident happened when David was working on repairing his barn roof after work hours. He had set up floodlights so he could see what he was doing in the evening darkness. A neighbor called the police, reporting strange lights and suspicious nighttime activity at his property. When the officer arrived, he found David in work clothes with a hammer and lumber, obviously doing legitimate home repairs. "Sorry about this," the officer said privately to David. "We have to respond to every call, but this is getting ridiculous. There's nothing suspicious about a man working on his own property." The pattern became clear. Any activity on David's property was being scrutinized and reported as problematic. Working in his garden during daylight hours resulted in complaints about excessive dust. Having a delivery truck bring building supplies led to reports of commercial traffic. Even something as simple as burning leaves in a controlled fire pit brought accusations of creating hazardous air quality. David began documenting every incident, keeping copies of all letters and reports. He consulted with a lawyer who confirmed that all of his activities were legal and that the HOA had no authority over his property. But the lawyer also warned that fighting constant harassment through the legal system would be expensive and time-consuming. The stress was affecting David's daily life. He found himself constantly looking over his shoulder, wondering what normal activity would trigger the next complaint. The joy he had felt in those first months of home ownership was being replaced by anxiety and frustration. His dream of peaceful country living was turning into a nightmare of bureaucratic harassment and neighborhood hostility. Despite everything, David refused to back down. This was his land, legally purchased and properly maintained. He had done nothing wrong and wasn't going to be bullied into giving up his rights or his dreams. But he also began to understand that his neighbor's campaign against him was about much more than chickens and vegetables. Something deeper was driving their determination to make his life difficult, and David suspected the worst was yet to come. The phone call came on a Monday morning in early March, just as David was getting ready for work. It was his neighbor's voice, but not one he recognized immediately. The man sounded nervous and spoke quickly. "Hey, I think you should know. There's been construction happening near your property while you were gone last week. Big trucks, workers, lots of activity. I wasn't sure if you knew about it." David felt his stomach drop. He had been away for 6 days on a work trip, training new engineers at his company's facility 3 states away. During that time, he had barely thought about the ongoing neighborhood tensions, actually enjoying the break from constant worry about what complaint might be waiting for him next. "What kind of construction?" David asked, already grabbing his keys and heading for the door. "You better just come see for yourself," the neighbor replied before hanging up. The drive from David's house to the main road normally took about 2 minutes down a gravel path that connected his property to the county road. It was the route he had used every single day since moving in, the natural and obvious way to access his land. But as David rounded the final curve that morning, he couldn't believe what he was seeing. A massive wooden barrier stretched across the entire eastern edge of his property line. It was easily 6 feet tall, made of solid wooden boards painted a uniform brown color. The barrier looked professional and permanent, with concrete footings and metal support posts. It completely blocked his usual route to and from his house. David parked his truck and walked along the length of the barrier, trying to understand what had happened. The structure ran for almost 300 feet, following the exact property line between his land and the HOA's common area. At the center of the barrier was a single gate, secured with a heavy-duty lock and chain. The construction was clearly expensive and well-planned. This wasn't something thrown together quickly. It must have taken several days of work with professional crews and heavy equipment. David realized with growing anger that his neighbors had deliberately waited until he was out of town to build this massive obstruction. David pulled out his phone and called Patricia Whitfield immediately. She answered after several rings, her voice artificially sweet and innocent. "Oh, hello, David. How was your business trip?" "What is this barrier doing on my property line?" David demanded, not bothering with pleasantries. "I'm not sure what you mean," Patricia replied, though David could hear the satisfaction in her voice. "We've made some improvements to our common areas for the security and privacy of our residents. This thing blocks my access to my own house." "Well, that's unfortunate," Patricia said, not sounding sorry at all. "But the barrier is built entirely on HOA property. We have every right to manage our common areas as we see fit." David spent the rest of the day calling lawyers, county offices, and anyone else he could think of who might help him understand his options. The news was frustrating, but not surprising. The barrier was indeed built on land that technically belonged to the homeowners association. While it obviously targeted David and made his life difficult, it wasn't illegal. That evening, David had to drive almost 2 miles out of his way to reach his house, using a back route through muddy farm roads that hadn't been designed for regular traffic. What used to be a simple 2-minute drive to the main road now took 15 minutes of careful navigation through ruts and potholes. The next morning brought another unpleasant surprise. Patricia arrived at David's door with 2 other HOA board members, all carrying official-looking paperwork. They stood on his porch like a delegation, clearly enjoying the power dynamic. "We're here to discuss the gate access situation," Patricia announced formally. She explained that the HOA was willing to provide David with access through their gate, but only under specific conditions. He would need to pay a $500 monthly fee for gate access and maintenance. Additionally, he would have to allow quarterly property inspections to ensure his land use remained compatible with neighborhood standards. $500 a month? David repeated, stunned. "To use a gate so I can access my own property? The fee covers our costs for maintaining the gate mechanism and monitoring access," one of the other board members explained, "plus insurance and administrative expenses." David knew this was extortion disguised as a legitimate fee. $500 monthly would add up to $6,000 per year just for the privilege of driving to his own house. The quarterly inspections were clearly designed to give them ongoing opportunities to harass him about his chickens, garden, and any other activities they disapproved of. "And if I refuse?" David asked. Patricia smiled coldly. "Then you'll need to find another way to access your property. The gate remains locked to unauthorized users." David's lawyer confirmed what he already suspected. The HOA's demands were unreasonable, but fighting them would be expensive and time-consuming. A lawsuit could take years and cost tens of thousands of dollars, with no guarantee of success. Meanwhile, David would still need to access his property somehow. The back route to David's house became a daily nightmare. The unpaved farm roads were never intended for regular commuter traffic. During dry weather, clouds of dust covered everything. When it rained, the roads turned into muddy swamps that could trap vehicles for hours. David's truck got stuck 3 times in the first month, requiring expensive tow truck rescues. The route also added significant time and stress to David's daily routine. His morning commute, which used to take 20 minutes, now required 45 minutes of careful driving. Evening returns were even worse, especially during winter when the poorly lit back roads became dangerous in the darkness. David's work performance began suffering from the constant stress and exhaustion. He was late to meetings when road conditions were particularly bad. His supervisor noticed the change and asked if everything was okay at home. David tried to explain the situation, but it sounded almost too bizarre to believe. The barrier became a daily reminder of his neighbor's hostility. Every morning as he drove the long way around to reach the main road, David had to look at the structure that was specifically built to make his life miserable. It was psychological warfare designed to wear him down and force him to give up. Winter made everything worse. Snow and ice turned the back roads into treacherous obstacle courses. David invested in heavy-duty tires and emergency supplies, knowing that getting stranded could mean spending hours in freezing temperatures waiting for help. Several times, he had to stay overnight at a hotel rather than risk the dangerous drive home. The HOA's quarterly newsletter featured articles about maintaining community standards and protecting property values, with thinly veiled references to problems with non-conforming land uses in the area. David realized his neighbors were treating his situation as a victory, proof that their association could effectively deal with undesirable elements. Local businesses began taking sides in the conflict. The hardware store owner, Tom, privately, told David he thought the barrier was wrong and offered to sell him supplies at cost for any legal countermeasures. But other merchants were HOA members themselves and clearly supported the association's actions. David's social life suffered too. Friends stopped visiting as frequently because reaching his house had become such an ordeal. Family gatherings became complicated logistical challenges. His elderly parents struggled with the rough back roads when they came to visit, making David feel even more isolated from the people he cared about. The financial impact was significant as well. Extra fuel costs, vehicle maintenance from rough road conditions, and towing expenses added up to hundreds of dollars each month. David was essentially being taxed for living on his own property, facing costs that his neighbors never had to consider. Despite everything, David refused to surrender. This was his land, legally purchased and rightfully owned. He had done nothing wrong and wouldn't be driven away by bullying tactics disguised as community standards. But the barrier represented more than just an inconvenience. It was a symbol of how far his neighbors were willing to go to force him out. Each day as David made the difficult journey to and from his home, he grew more determined to find a solution. The HOA thought they had trapped him, but David was already starting to research property records and legal precedents. He suspected his neighbors might have made a critical mistake in their eagerness to build their barrier, and he was determined to find it. The breakthrough came on a rainy Thursday evening in late October. David had been spending his nights at the county courthouse, digging through decades of property records and legal documents. His eyes were tired from reading tiny print on old papers, but something kept pushing him forward. He knew the HOA had made their barrier decision quickly, and quick decisions often meant overlooked details. That night, David found what he was looking for buried in a stack of documents from 2006. It was a property transfer form that should have deeded the strip of land where the barrier stood from the county to the Millbrook Hills HOA. The form was filled out correctly, signed by the right people, and looked completely legitimate. But when David cross-referenced it with the county's official property database, he discovered something incredible. The transfer had never been properly recorded. David's Hands were shaking as he pulled up more documents on the courthouse computer. The 100-foot strip of land that everyone assumed belonged to the HOA was still listed as county property. It had been sitting in legal limbo for 15 years because someone at the county office had filed the paperwork in the wrong place. He printed every document he could find and rushed home to call his lawyer. Even at 9 p.m., David couldn't wait until morning to share this discovery. "Are you absolutely sure about this?" his lawyer asked after reviewing the documents David emailed. "Over. I've triple-checked everything," David replied. "That land legally belongs to the county, not the HOA, and according to the county website, it's scheduled for a tax auction next month to resolve the ownership issue." The lawyer was quiet for a long moment. "David, do you realize what this means? If you bought that land, you would own the barrier and the only gate that provides access to 23 homes in that subdivision." David had realized exactly that, and he had been grinning all the way home from the courthouse. The next few weeks were tense but exciting. David had to keep his discovery secret while preparing for the auction. He researched the bidding process, arranged financing, and studied comparable land values in the area. The strip was small but valuable because of its strategic location. The auction notice was published in the local newspaper, as required by law, but it was buried in the legal notices section that most people never read. The description was technical and boring. Tax auction. Parcel number 8472B, 100 FT x 300 FT strip, zoned residential common area, adjacent to Millbrook Hills subdivision. David was amazed that none of his HOA neighbors noticed the auction listing. They were so confident in their ownership of the land that they never bothered to verify their legal standing. Their overconfidence was about to become their downfall. On auction day, David arrived at the county building early. Only 3 other people showed up to bid, and none of them seemed particularly interested in the small strip of land. The auctioneer described the property quickly, mentioning that it currently had structures on it that would convey with the land. Bidding started at $5,000. One person bid $6,000, another went to $8,000. David waited patiently, knowing that patience was key in auctions. When the bidding slowed down around $10,000, David made his move, jumping the bid to $12,000. The other bidders looked surprised, but didn't counteroffer. Going once, going twice, sold to bidder number 47 for $12,000. David could barely contain his excitement as he completed the paperwork and paid for his purchase. He was now the legal owner of the land that contained the barrier his neighbors had built to keep him out. The irony was perfect, but David didn't reveal his victory immediately. He spent the next week consulting with lawyers and planning his next moves carefully. He wanted to handle the situation professionally and legally, even though his neighbors had shown him no such courtesy. The first step was getting the property officially surveyed and marked. David hired a professional surveying company to establish the exact boundaries of his new land. When the surveyors arrived with their equipment and started putting up official boundary markers, a few neighbors came out to watch with confused expressions. Patricia Whitfield approached the surveyors and demanded to know what they were doing on HOA property. The head surveyor politely showed her the official county documents proving David's ownership. Patricia's face went white as she realized what had happened. David watched from his truck as Patricia frantically called other HOA board members. Within an hour, a small crowd of neighbors had gathered around the barrier, all talking at once and pointing at the survey markers. David decided it was time to make his ownership official. He walked over to the group with a folder full of legal documents. "Good morning, everyone. I wanted to let you know that I'm the new owner of this land." The silence was deafening. Several people looked at the documents David handed out, but Patricia was the first to speak. "This has to be some kind of mistake," she said, but her voice lacked its usual confidence. "No mistake," David replied calmly. "The county auctioned this land last week to resolve a 15-year-old paperwork error. I was the winning bidder." One of The other board members stepped forward. "But our barrier is built on this land." "Yes, it is," David acknowledged. "Along with the gate that controls access to your homes. As the legal property owner, I now control that gate." The reality of the situation hit them like a thunderbolt. Their own barrier, built specifically to trap David, had now become their prison. The gate they controlled yesterday was now controlled by the man they had tried to force out. David had prepared certified letters for all 23 homeowners affected by the gate closure. He handed copies to Patricia and the other board members who were present. The letters were professional and straightforward, informing them that he was the new property owner and that gate access would be temporarily suspended while he reviewed the situation. The panic that followed was immediate and intense. Several homeowners started making phone calls, presumably to lawyers and real estate agents. Others began demanding explanations from Patricia and the HOA board. A few tried reasoning with David directly, suddenly adopting friendly tones they hadn't used since his first week in the neighborhood. "Surely we can work something out," Patricia said, her earlier hostility replaced by obvious desperation. "We can discuss reasonable terms for access." David smiled politely. "I'll consider any reasonable proposals, but I'll need some time to think about what terms would be fair." Over the next few days, the full impact of David's purchase became clear throughout the subdivision. Real estate agents started getting calls from panicked homeowners wanting to know how the gate situation would affect their property values. Some residents couldn't get to work because they were afraid to leave their cars outside the barrier overnight. Others had to cancel appointments and deliveries because service providers couldn't reach their homes. The HOA called an emergency meeting, but without gate access, it was difficult for all members to attend. Patricia had to stand outside the barrier and shout updates to residents who were trapped inside. The scene was both chaotic and somewhat comical. David received dozens of phone calls, emails, and letters during that first week. Some neighbors tried anger and threats, warning him about lawsuits and legal consequences. Others attempted guilt, trips, talking about children who couldn't get to school and elderly residents who needed medical access. A few tried bribery, offering cash payments for immediate gate access. But David had learned patience during his months of dealing with HOA harassment. He took time to research his options and consult with lawyers about the best path forward. He wanted a resolution that would protect him from future harassment while being reasonable to neighbors who hadn't been directly involved in the campaign against him. After 2 weeks of negotiations, David presented his terms. The HOA would need to provide a formal written apology for their harassment campaign. They would pay his legal fees from the past year, totaling $8,500. They would provide a settlement payment of $50,000 for the damages and inconvenience he had suffered. Most importantly, they would sign a legally binding agreement promising that his property would never again be subject to complaints or interference from the HOA. The negotiations took another week, with lots of back and forth through lawyers. But ultimately, the HOA had no choice but to accept David's terms. Their residents were furious about being trapped, property values were already dropping, and legal challenges to David's ownership had no chance of success. The settlement was finalized on a cold December morning. David received his apology letter, his legal fees, and his $50,000 check. In return, he had an automatic gate system installed that provided 24-hour access to the neighborhood residents. But David kept one important detail. He retained the right to revoke access if the harassment ever resumed. The gate cards he provided to his neighbors came with a clear message: respect his property rights or lose access to their own homes.